The train's whistle pierced the morning air as it pulled into Silver Creek Station, and Margaret O'Sullivan pressed her face to the dusty window, her heart hammering against her ribs. The year was 1885, and after 3 days of bone-rattling travel from Boston, she had finally reached the Colorado Territory. Her carefully folded letters from Thomas Whitmore were tucked safely in her leather satchel. Each one read so many times the creases had worn soft. In those letters, he had painted pictures of his successful cattle ranch, his longing for a wife to share his prosperity, and most importantly, his promise that he would love her regardless of her past. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret smoothed her navy wool traveling dress and adjusted the small hat pinned to her auburn hair. She was 24, older than most mail-order brides, and she carried a secret that had driven her from Boston, a secret she believed Thomas already knew and had accepted. In her correspondence, she had been brutally honest about her circumstances, about the scandal that had forced her to leave everything behind. Thomas had written back with understanding and compassion, assuring her that her past didn't matter. To him, that he was looking for a woman of character, not society's approval. As the train shuddered to a halt, Margaret gathered her courage along with her belongings. She had sold everything she owned to afford this journey, keeping only her mother's pearl earrings and a few precious books. Her entire life now fit into a single carpet bag and a small trunk. But Thomas had promised her a fresh start, a chance to build something beautiful together on his ranch in the mountains. The conductor helped her down onto the wooden platform, where dust swirled in the thin mountain air. Silver Creek was larger than she had expected, with a proper main street lined with false-fronted buildings, a bank, a general store, and even a small hotel. Wagons rolled past, loaded with supplies, and miners in dusty clothes mixed with well-dressed townspeople. The Rocky Mountains loomed in the distance, their peaks capped with early snow despite the September warmth. Margaret's eyes searched the crowd for a tall man with dark hair and kind eyes, as Thomas had described himself. Her fingers traced the outline of his last letter in her satchel, where he had promised to meet her at precisely 2 o'clock, wearing a blue vest so she would recognize him. She spotted several men in blue, but none seemed to be looking for her with the eager anticipation she had hoped to see. As minutes ticked by, doubt began to creep into her thoughts. She moved closer to the station house, trying to stay out of the way of bustling passengers and freight handlers. A woman in an elegant green dress swept past with her gentleman companion, and Margaret caught a snippet of their conversation about that Whitmore business, and something about finally showing his face in town. The words sent a chill through her, but before she could process their meaning, a voice called out behind her, "Miss O'Sullivan?" She turned to find a young man approaching, perhaps 19 or 20, with sandy brown hair and earnest blue eyes. He was well-dressed, but not in the style she had expected of a successful rancher. His clothes were clean but showed signs of hard wear, and his hands bore the calluses of manual labor. "Yes, I'm Margaret O'Sullivan," she replied, offering a tentative smile. "Are you Thomas?" The young man's expression grew uncomfortable. "No, ma'am. I'm Daniel Crawford, Mr. Whitmore's foreman. He sent me to collect you and bring you out to the ranch. He was unable to come to town today." Margaret felt her first stab of disappointment. After months of correspondence, she had envisioned their meeting countless times, but never had Thomas been absent from it. "Is he unwell?" she asked, concern creeping into her voice. Daniel shifted his weight, avoiding her direct gaze. "No, ma'am, he's fine. Just had some business to attend to that couldn't wait. The ranch keeps him mighty busy this time of year." He gestured toward a sturdy wagon hitched to 2 horses. "If you'll gather your things, we can head out now. It's about an hour's ride to the Broken Arrow Ranch." As Daniel loaded her trunk into the wagon bed, Margaret noticed other passengers being greeted by their loved ones with warm embraces and joyful tears. Her own arrival felt strangely hollow by comparison. She climbed onto the wagon seat beside Daniel, who clicked his tongue to set the horses in motion. "Have you worked for Mr. Whitmore long?" she asked as they rolled through Silver Creek's main street. "Going on 2 years now," Daniel replied, keeping his eyes on the road ahead. "He's a good man, treats his workers fair. You'll be happy at the ranch, ma'am." Margaret studied his profile, noting the tension in his jaw. "You seem troubled, Mr. Crawford. Is there something I should know?" Daniel was quiet for a long moment, then shook his head. "It's not my place to say anything, ma'am. Mr. Whitmore will explain everything when we arrive." The cryptic response unsettled Margaret further, but she decided not to press. Perhaps Thomas was simply nervous about their meeting, just as she was. After all, entering into marriage with a stranger, even one who had written such beautiful letters, was daunting for anyone. As they left the town behind, the landscape opened into rolling hills dotted with cattle. The air was crisp and clean, scented with pine and sage. Margaret had spent her entire life in the cramped, sooty streets of Boston, and the vast openness of the Colorado Territory was both beautiful and overwhelming. Mountains rose like cathedral spires on all sides, their faces painted in shades of purple and gold by the afternoon sun. "It's magnificent," she murmured, drinking in the scenery. Daniel's expression softened slightly. "Yes, ma'am. I came out here from Ohio myself, and I've never regretted it. There's something about this land that gets into your blood." They passed several other ranches, each marked by split-rail fences and grazing herds. Margaret noticed that some of the properties looked more prosperous than others. When she asked about this, Daniel explained the challenges of ranching in the territory: harsh winters, cattle rustlers, disputes over water rights, and the constant threat of drought. "Mr. Whitmore's ranch is one of the most successful in the area," Daniel said with pride. "He's built something impressive out there." As they crested a hill, Daniel pointed ahead. "There it is, the Broken Arrow." Margaret's breath caught in her throat. The ranch spread across a wide valley, with the main house nestled against a backdrop of aspen trees that had turned brilliant gold. The house itself was larger than she had dared to imagine, a 2-story structure built of local stone and timber, with a wide porch that wrapped around the front and sides. Outbuildings dotted the property: a massive barn, several smaller structures for equipment and feed, and corrals filled with horses. "It's beautiful," Margaret said, feeling some of her earlier anxiety ease. Clearly, Thomas had not exaggerated his success. But as they drew closer, she began to notice odd details. The main house, while impressive, had an empty quality about it. No smoke rose from the chimneys despite the cooling afternoon air. No women's touches were visible on the porch, no flower boxes, no curtains in the windows, no signs of domestic life. The entire place felt almost abandoned, despite its obvious prosperity. Daniel guided the wagon around to the back of the house, where a smaller building stood apart from the others. "Mr. Whitmore asked me to show you to the guest quarters first," he explained, climbing down to help her from the wagon. "He thought you might want to rest and freshen up after your journey before you meet." The guest quarters turned out to be a modest but comfortable cabin with a stone fireplace, a simple bed, a washstand, and a small table with 2 chairs. Someone had made an effort to make it welcoming. Wildflowers sat in a mason jar on the table, and fresh linens covered the bed. But the separation from the main house struck Margaret as strange. "Where is Mr. Whitmore now?" she asked as Daniel set her trunk just inside the door. He'll be along shortly," Daniel said, that uncomfortable expression returning to his face. "He wanted me to tell you that he's been looking forward to your arrival more than you can imagine." Something in his tone made Margaret study his face more carefully. "Mr. Crawford, I feel as though you're not telling me something important. Have I misunderstood the nature of my invitation here? Daniel removed his hat and ran his fingers through his hair, clearly struggling with some internal conflict. Ma'am, it's not my story to tell. But I will say this: Mr. Whitmore is a good man who's been through more than his share of hardship. Whatever happens tonight, please remember that. Before Margaret could ask what he meant by whatever happens, Daniel tipped his hat and strode back to his wagon. She watched him drive toward the barn, leaving her alone with her swirling thoughts and growing apprehension. Inside the cabin, Margaret unpacked her few belongings and changed from her traveling dress into her best blue wool gown, the one she had saved for their first meeting. She pinned her mother's pearl earrings in place and arranged her auburn hair in a style she hoped was both modest and becoming. Through the small window, she could see the main house in the distance, its windows beginning to glow with lamplight as evening approached. As she waited, Margaret reread Thomas's letters, searching for clues about what Daniel's cryptic warnings might mean. The letters were filled with details about ranch life, questions about her preferences and dreams, and expressions of growing affection. In one, he had written, "I find myself thinking of you often, Margaret, and wondering if you could truly be happy with a man like me. I fear I have not been entirely forthcoming about certain aspects of my life, but I hope that when we meet, you will see past the surface to the heart of who I am." At the time, she had interpreted this as modesty or perhaps concern about their class differences. Now, she wondered if there was something more significant he had been hiding. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Margaret's heart leaped, thinking it must be Thomas at last. But when she opened the door, she found a middle-aged Mexican woman holding a covered tray. "Buenas tardes, señorita. I am Rosa Mendez, the cook," the woman said in accented English. "Senator Whitmore asked me to bring you supper and to tell you that he will come to speak with you after you have eaten." Rosa's manner was kind but guarded, and Margaret sensed the same undercurrent of tension she had felt with Daniel. "Thank you, Mrs. Mendez. The food smells wonderful." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Rosa set the tray on the table and began uncovering dishes of roasted chicken, fresh bread, and vegetables. "You are very pretty," she said, studying Margaret with dark, compassionate eyes. "Senator Thomas, he has been so nervous about your coming. He is a good man, but what?" Margaret prompted gently. Rosa shook her head. "It is not for me to say, but I will tell you this. He needs someone who can see past the outside to the corazon, the heart. Perhaps you are that person." After Rosa left, Margaret tried to eat, but her appetite had deserted her. The mysterious comments from everyone she had met were building into a crescendo of anxiety. What secret was Thomas hiding that had everyone walking on eggshells? She had been completely honest about her own past, the scandal that had destroyed her reputation in Boston, the reason she had been forced to leave everything behind. Thomas had assured her that none of that mattered to him. What could he possibly be concealing that was worse than what she had already confessed? As darkness fell over the valley, Margaret lit the oil lamp on the table and settled into one of the chairs to wait. Through the window, she could see lights moving in the main house, suggesting Thomas was finally preparing to meet her. Her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed her skirts and checked her reflection in the small mirror above the washstand. The sound of footsteps on the wooden porch made her heart race. This was it, the moment she had traveled halfway across the country to experience. She stood and faced the door, trying to project more confidence than she felt. The knock, when it came, was hesitant, almost reluctant. "Come in," Margaret called, her voice barely above a whisper. The door opened slowly, and a figure stepped into the lamplight. Margaret's carefully prepared greeting died on her lips as she took in the sight before her. The man standing in her doorway was indeed tall and dark-haired, as Thomas had described himself in his letters. But his face was a map of old pain burn. Scars covered the left side of his face and neck, pulling at his eye and twisting his mouth into a permanent half-grimace. His left hand, she noticed, was also scarred and partially missing 2 fingers. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Margaret fought to keep her expression neutral, remembering Rosa's words about seeing past the outside to the heart. This was Thomas, the man who had written her such beautiful letters, who had promised to love her regardless of her past. "Miss O'Sullivan," he said finally, his voice deep but rough, as if speaking caused him physical pain. "I'm Thomas Whitmore. I suppose you weren't expecting." He gestured vaguely at his face. Margaret found her voice at last. "Mr. Whitmore, it's good to finally meet you." She gestured to the chairs at the table. "Please sit down. We have a great deal to discuss." Thomas remained standing, his posture rigid with shame and expectation of rejection. "I understand if you want to leave immediately. Daniel can take you back to town first thing in the morning, and I'll pay for your return journey to Boston." "I'm not going anywhere," Margaret said firmly, surprised by her own resolve. "Not until we've talked properly. You wrote to me about honesty and acceptance. I think it's time we both practiced what we've preached." Thomas's scarred face registered surprise, and for the first time since entering the cabin, his shoulders relaxed slightly. He moved carefully to the table and sat down across from her, keeping his damaged side turned away as much as possible. "The fire happened 2 years ago," he began without preamble. "Lightning strikes during the drought. I was trapped in the barn trying to save the horses. By the time my men pulled me out," he touched his face unconsciously, "the doctor in Denver said I was lucky to survive." Margaret nodded, beginning to understand the weight of what he had been carrying. "Is that why you never mentioned it in your letters? Why couldn't you come to meet me at the station?" "I haven't been to town since it happened," Thomas admitted. "People stare. Children run away," I thought. "I hoped that if you got to know me through letters first, maybe when you saw me, you'd be able to see past this." The raw vulnerability in his voice tugged at Margaret's heart. She had expected many things from this evening, but not this, not a man so wounded by cruelty that he had hidden himself away from the world. "Thomas," she said gently, "I need to tell you something about why I left Boston. About the secret I thought you already knew and accepted." Margaret leaned forward slightly, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "In Boston, I was engaged to a prominent banker's son, Richard Hartwell. The wedding was planned, the invitations sent, my trousseau complete. But 3 weeks before our ceremony, Richard's business partner discovered that Richard had been embezzling funds from their clients' accounts to support his gambling debts." Thomas's scarred face remained still, but she saw something shift in his eyes, a recognition of pain that understood pain. "The scandal broke in all the newspapers," Margaret continued. "Richard disappeared one night, taking what remained of the stolen money. But society assumed I must have known, must have been complicit. The Hartwells accused me of being a fortune hunter who had seduced their son into crime. My own reputation was destroyed overnight." She paused, gathering strength for the most difficult part. "But that wasn't the worst of it. When the authorities investigated Richard's finances, they discovered he had forged my signature on several promissory notes. Suddenly, I wasn't just a disgraced former fiancé. I was potentially liable for thousands of dollars in debt." Thomas shifted in his chair, his damaged hand clenching into a fist. "But surely when they realized you had been deceived, the law didn't care about my innocence," Margaret said bitterly. "I had to sell everything I owned, my parents' house, my mother's jewelry, everything except these earrings, just to pay the lawyers who proved I wasn't guilty of fraud. Even then, Richard's creditors came after me for the gambling debts. I was left with nothing, and no respectable family in Boston would associate with me." She looked directly at Thomas, making sure he could see the resolve in her eyes. "That's why I answered your advertisement. I told you all of this in my very first letter, and you wrote back saying that you didn't care about society's judgment, that you valued character over reputation. I hoped I had found someone who truly understood what it meant to be condemned for circumstances beyond my control. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the table between them. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow. I remember that letter. But Margaret, I think there's been a terrible misunderstanding. A cold dread began to spread through Margaret's chest. What do you mean? Thomas stood abruptly and walked to the window, keeping his scarred side turned away from her. I never read your letters, any of them. The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. I don't understand. We corresponded for months. You wrote to me about the ranch, about wanting a wife, about my sister wrote those letters. Thomas's voice was barely audible. Carolyn lives in Denver with her husband. After the fire, when I couldn't bring myself to leave the ranch anymore, she became worried about my isolation. She placed the advertisement without my knowledge and handled all the correspondence. Margaret's world tilted on its axis. Your sister? Thomas turned back to face her, and she could see the shame burning in his eyes. Carolyn thought that if she could find someone willing to come here, someone looking for a fresh start, maybe I would have a reason to rejoin the living. She told me about you, about your intelligence and kindness in the letters, but she didn't share the details of your situation. The blood drained from Margaret's face as the full implications hit her. So you don't know about Richard, about the scandal, about why I had to leave Boston? Not until just now, Thomas admitted. And Carolyn never told you about this. He gestured to his scars. She probably hoped that by the time you arrived, it wouldn't matter. Margaret sank back in her chair, feeling as though the ground had been pulled out from beneath her. Everything. She thought she knew, every comfort she had drawn from Thomas's supposed acceptance and understanding had been built on a lie. So when you wrote about not caring about my past, about valuing character over reputation, those were Caroline's words, not mine, Thomas said quietly. I'm sorry, Margaret. I know how cruel this must seem. The weight of her situation crashed down on her with devastating force. She had spent every penny she had to make this journey, burned every bridge in Boston, and traveled across the continent to marry a man who had never actually agreed to marry her. Worse, he knew nothing about her circumstances and had no reason to feel the compassion and acceptance she had been counting on. I should never have let Carolyn do this, Thomas continued, his voice thick with regret. I told her it was a mistake, that no woman would want to tie herself to someone like me. But she insisted that there were women who might be willing to look past appearances for security and companionship. Margaret felt her cheeks burn with humiliation. So she was meant to be a desperate woman willing to accept any husband, no matter how damaged, in exchange for financial security. The romantic notion of two wounded souls finding healing in each other had been nothing but fantasy. She meant well, Thomas added hastily, seeing Margaret's stricken expression. Carolyn genuinely believed she could help both of us. She said you seemed like a remarkable woman in your letters, someone who had faced hardship with grace and dignity. But you never wanted a wife at all, Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas was quiet for so long that Margaret wondered if he would answer at all. Finally, he returned to his chair, moving with the careful deliberation of a man who had learned to navigate the world with changed limitations. Before the fire, yes, I had hoped to marry someday. I was even courting a young woman in town, Sarah Mitchell, the banker's daughter. We had an understanding, nothing formal, but everyone expected an engagement announcement soon. Margaret's heart sank further. There had been someone else, someone who belonged to the world Thomas had been forced to leave behind. After the fire, when I was still bandaged and healing, Sarah came to visit once, Thomas continued, his voice growing harder. She took one look at me and excused herself. I heard later that she married a cattle buyer from Denver within 2 months. Her father made it clear that the bank would no longer be handling any business for the Broken Arrow Ranch. The bitterness in his voice made Margaret wince. She was beginning to understand the depth of Thomas's isolation, the way his disfigurement had cost him not just his physical appearance, but his entire social existence. "So you see," Thomas said, "Caroline's plan was doomed from the start. I have nothing to offer a wife, no social standing, no future in town society, no prospect of a normal life. I can't even show my face in public without causing a scene." Margaret studied his profile as he spoke, noting the way he unconsciously kept his scarred side angled away from her. The physical wounds were only part of his damage. The deeper injury was to his sense of self-worth. "What about the ranch?" she asked. "Daniel said it was very successful." "The land produces well, and we have good cattle," Thomas acknowledged. "But I can't conduct business in person anymore. Everything has to go through intermediaries, which costs more and makes deals more complicated. Some suppliers won't work with us at all because they think I'm hiding something worse than scars, maybe insanity or criminality." The practical implications of his isolation were staggering. Margaret began to understand why the beautiful ranch house had felt so empty and lifeless. Thomas wasn't just physically scarred. He was completely cut off from normal human interaction. "How do you manage?" she asked. "Daniel handles most of the business in town. Rosa and her husband Manuel take care of the domestic needs. I have a few loyal ranch hands who've stayed on despite the talk. Mostly, I just exist." The bleakness in his voice pierced Margaret's heart. She thought of her own isolation in Boston after the scandal, the way former friends had crossed the street to avoid her, the whispered conversations that stopped when she entered a room. But at least she had been able to leave, to seek a new life elsewhere. Thomas was trapped by his own shame and society's cruelty. "Thomas," she said gently, "you spoke of Caroline's plan being doomed from the start, but what do you want? Not what your sister wants for you, not what you think you should want, but what you actually desire for your life." He looked at her with surprise, as if no one had asked him that question in a very long time. "I don't think it matters what I want. The choices were made for me the night of that fire." "That's not an answer," Margaret pressed. "Do you want to spend the rest of your life hiding on this ranch? Do you want to let Sarah Mitchell and people like her define your worth?" Thomas's jaw tightened. It's easy to talk about defying society when you haven't lived with the stars and the whispers. Children point at me. Women gasp and turn away. Men look at me with pity or disgust. After a while, it becomes easier to simply avoid putting yourself through that humiliation. Margaret felt a surge of recognition. "I understand that better than you might think." In Boston, after the scandal, I became curious. People would invite me to social gatherings just to see the woman who had been ruined by Richard Hartwell. They would whisper behind their fans and watch to see if I would break down in public. "But you left," Thomas pointed out. "You found a way to escape." "Only because I had nothing left to lose," Margaret replied. "And only because I believed I was coming to someone who understood what it meant to start over." She paused, feeling the full weight of her situation settling on her shoulders. "Now I find myself in the same position I was in Boston, unwanted and with nowhere to go." Thomas winced as if she had struck him. "Margaret, I never said you were unwanted." "Didn't you?" she challenged me. "You've made it very clear that you never chose to bring me here, that you have nothing to offer a wife, that you're not capable of the kind of life I was expecting. How else should I interpret that?" "I'm trying to be honest about the reality of the situation," Thomas said defensively. "You deserve better than to be trapped here with someone who can't give you a normal life." "And what if I don't want a normal life?" Margaret shot back, surprising herself with her vehemence. "What if I'm tired of being judged by society's narrow standards? What if I came here not because I was desperate for any husband, but because I genuinely hoped to find someone who valued substance over superficial appearances?" Thomas stared at her, clearly taken aback by her intensity. "You don't know what you're saying." You've been here for one evening. You haven't experienced the reality of what it means to be associated with someone like me. Someone like you." Margaret stood, her patience finally snapping. A successful rancher who owns beautiful land and employs people who clearly respect him. A man who survived a terrible accident and still manages to run a complex business. Someone who was kind enough to feel guilty about his sister's deception, instead of simply taking advantage of it. Thomas's mouth opened slightly, but no words came. "Let me tell you what I see when I look at you, Thomas Whitmore," Margaret continued, her voice growing stronger. "I see a man who has allowed other people's narrow-mindedness to convince him that he's worthless. I see someone who has so much to offer, but has decided that his scars define his entire existence. I see a person who is choosing to live as a victim instead of a survivor." "That's not fair," Thomas said, his voice rough with emotion. "Isn't it?" Margaret moved closer to him, forcing him to look at her directly. "You said to yourself that the ranch is successful, that you have loyal employees, that you've built something meaningful here. But you're so focused on what you've lost that you can't see what you still have." Thomas stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. "You think it's that simple? You think I just need to decide to be brave and everything will be fine?" "I think you need to decide whether you want to live or just exist," Margaret replied. "Because right now, you're not really doing either." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Thomas's scarred face was flushed with anger and something else, perhaps recognition of an uncomfortable truth. "You have no idea what you're talking about," he said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. "Don't I?" Margaret asked quietly. "I lost everything too, Thomas. My reputation, my security, my future, my faith in people. I could have hidden away in a boarding house somewhere, living off charity and self-pity. Instead, I chose to risk everything, on the possibility that somewhere in this vast country, there might be someone willing to see past the surface to who I really am." She moved to the table and picked up one of his letters, Caroline's letters, and held it up. "Your sister saw something in my correspondence that made her believe I was worth bringing here. Maybe she saw the same thing in you that made her believe you were worth saving from your isolation." Thomas reached for the letter, and their hands brushed. Margaret felt the roughened skin of his scars, the missing fingers that spoke of unimaginable pain, endured and survived. She didn't pull away. "I can't be the man you thought you were coming to marry," Thomas said quietly. "I can't take you to social gatherings or give you a place in respectable society. I can't even promise that I'll ever be comfortable showing my face in public again." "I never asked for any of those things," Margaret replied. "But I am asking for honesty. Not your sister's version of what she thinks we both need to hear, but the truth about what you want. Do you want me to leave tomorrow, or do you want to find out if two people who have both lost everything might be able to build something new together?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his eyes searching her face as if looking for signs of deception or pity. "And if I said I wanted you to stay? What then? We're strangers, Margaret. We know nothing real about each other." "Then we learn," Margaret said simply. "We start with the truth and see where it leads." Thomas pulled his hand away from hers and walked back to the window. Outside, the ranch was quiet except for the distant sound of cattle settling for the night and the whisper of wind through the aspen trees. "There's something else," he said without turning around. "Something Carolyn didn't know when she wrote those letters. Something that makes this whole situation even more impossible." Margaret's heart sank. Just when she thought they had reached some kind of understanding, there was another revelation, another complication. "What is it?" Thomas's reflection in the window showed a man wrestling with a decision that could change everything. "The bank is foreclosing on the ranch. I have until the end of October to pay off a loan that came due when my credit was destroyed along with my face. In 6 weeks, I'll have nothing left to offer anyone." Margaret stared at Thomas's reflection in the window, processing his latest revelation. The foreclosure explained so much, the empty feel of the beautiful house, the tension she'd sensed in Daniel and Rosa, the desperate edge beneath Caroline's matchmaking scheme. But instead of the despair she might have expected to feel, Margaret found herself calculating, her mind already racing through possibilities. "How much do you owe?" she asked, her voice surprisingly steady. Thomas turned from the window, clearly expecting her to be packing her bags by now. $8,000. The original loan was for improvements to the ranch, new breeding stock, equipment, expanding the house. When my credit was destroyed after the fire, the bank called in the full amount. $8,000, Margaret repeated, tapping her fingers against the table. That's not insurmountable. What assets do you have that could be liquidated? Thomas blinked in surprise. Assets? Margaret, didn't you hear what I just said? I'm about to lose everything. I heard you, she replied crisply. But you're thinking like a victim instead of a businessman. You have cattle, horses, equipment, land. What's the ranch worth if you sold it piece by piece? I've never considered breaking it up, Thomas admitted. This ranch has been in my family for 15 years. My father built it from nothing. Margaret stood and began pacing the small cabin, her practical Boston upbringing taking over. Sentiment won't save it from foreclosure, but intelligent planning might. Tell me exactly what you own and what each piece might be worth. For the next hour, Thomas found himself pulled into a detailed discussion of his ranch's assets. Margaret's questions were sharp and businesslike. She wanted to know about breeding records, land values, equipment conditions, seasonal cash flow patterns. She had clearly absorbed more about business from her time in Richard's world than she had initially let on. The cattle alone should be worth at least $6,000 if you sell them before winter, she calculated, writing figures on a piece of paper. The horses are another $1,000. Some of the equipment could bring in $500. More. But then I have no ranch left to run, Thomas protested. You'd have no ranch anyway if it's foreclosed, Margaret pointed out pragmatically. At least this way, you'd pay off the debt and have something left over to start again. Thomas sank back in his chair, overwhelmed by the rapid-fire business discussion. I can't think that quickly about this. I've been dreading this debt for months, and you've been here one evening and you're already restructuring my entire operation. Margaret softened her tone slightly. I'm sorry. I don't mean to take over. It's just that I've been in a similar situation, watching everything slip away while feeling powerless to stop it. But sometimes an outside perspective can see solutions that aren't visible from the inside. Where did you learn to think about business this way? Thomas asked. Necessity, Margaret replied. When Richard's debts came after me, I had to become very good at asset evaluation very quickly. I had to know exactly what everything was worth and how to liquidate it efficiently to pay the lawyers and creditors. She sat back down across from him, her expression growing more personal. But there might be another option, one that doesn't require selling everything. What do you mean? Margaret hesitated, knowing that what she was about to suggest would change everything between them. Your sister arranged for me to come here as your mail-order bride. Legally, that's still a valid arrangement if we both choose to honor it. Thomas's scarred face flushed. Margaret, you can't be serious. After everything we've discussed, hear me out, she interrupted. I'm not talking about romance or love. I'm talking about a business partnership. A marriage of practical necessity that could benefit both of us. She leaned forward, her voice becoming more animated as she outlined her idea. I still have some connections in Boston, people who owe me favors, suppliers who respected my family's business before the scandal. With the right approach, I might be able to arrange extended credit terms or find investors interested in Western cattle operations. Why would you do that? Thomas asked, clearly bewildered. Because I need what you can offer just as much as you need what I can provide, Margaret said honestly. I have business skills but no capital and nowhere to apply them. You have assets and a proven operation but no access to Eastern financial networks. Together, we might be able to save the ranch and build something sustainable." Thomas stared at her for a long moment. "You're talking about a marriage of convenience, a business arrangement." "Exactly," Margaret confirmed. "No pretense of love or romance, just two people working together for mutual survival and benefit. You get someone who can help navigate the financial crisis and potentially restore your access to broader markets. I get security, purpose, and a chance to build something meaningful again. And when the crisis is over? When will the ranch be stable again?" Margaret had clearly thought this through. "We evaluate the situation. If we've worked well together and want to continue the partnership, we do. If we decide we'd both be happier pursuing separate lives, we dissolve the marriage and divide the assets fairly." The practical nature of her proposal seemed to calm some of Thomas's anxiety. This wasn't a desperate woman throwing herself at him out of romantic delusion. This was a businesswoman proposing a mutually beneficial arrangement. "You make it sound simple," he said. "The business side is relatively straightforward," Margaret acknowledged. "The personal side might be more complicated. We'd need to establish clear boundaries and expectations. I wouldn't expect. That is, I understand this wouldn't be a conventional marriage in all respects." Thomas's scarred cheek darkened with embarrassment. "Margaret, I can't ask you to tie yourself to someone who can't even show his face in public." "You're not asking, I'm offering," she corrected. "And as for public appearances, that's something we can work on gradually if you choose to. But for now, I can handle any business that requires face-to-face meetings in town." She stood and moved to the window, looking out at the ranch building silhouetted against the starry sky. "Thomas, I didn't come here looking for a fairy tale romance. I came here looking for a chance to build a life with someone who understood that appearances and social standing aren't the most important things in the world. Your sister may have deceived us both about the details, but the fundamental opportunity is still here." Thomas joined her at the window, standing carefully so his damaged side was turned away. "What about children? Most women want families." "Do you want children?" Margaret asked. I used to think about it, before the fire. Then it's something we could discuss in the future if our partnership proves successful," Margaret said pragmatically. "But right now, our priority should be saving the ranch." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, both contemplating the enormous shift their conversation had taken. What had begun as a painful revelation of mutual deception was evolving into something neither had expected, a genuine collaboration between two people who had both learned hard lessons about survival. "There's something else I should tell you," Thomas said finally, "about why the debt situation is so urgent." Margaret turned to face him. "What is it?" "The banker who's calling in the loan is James Mitchell, Sarah's father. The woman who—" He gestured vaguely at his face. "The one who rejected you after the fire," Margaret finished, understanding immediately. "So this isn't just business. It's personal. I can't prove it, but the timing suggests he's using the loan to force me out of the area entirely. He wants to make sure Sarah never has to risk encountering me again." Margaret felt a surge of anger on Thomas's behalf. That's vindictive and possibly illegal if he's not treating all borrowers equally. "Legal or not, it's effective," Thomas said bitterly. "He has the power to destroy me, and he's using it." "Not if we don't let him," Margaret said firmly. "Mitchell may have financial power, but he's made this personal, which means he's likely acting on emotion rather than sound business judgment. That gives us an advantage." "How do you figure that?" Margaret's eyes gleamed with the kind of strategic thinking that had helped her survive the scandal in Boston. Emotional decisions often leave vulnerabilities. If Mitchell is targeting you specifically rather than treating this as a standard foreclosure, there might be grounds to challenge his actions. More importantly, His personal motivation means he might be willing to accept terms that a purely rational banker wouldn't consider. What kind of terms? We'll have to see, Margaret said. But first, I need to understand exactly what kind of man we're dealing with. What's Mitchell's reputation in the community? Thomas considered the question. He's generally seen as fair, but strict. Conservative in his lending, but he's helped a lot of ranchers and miners get started. Before my situation, I'd have said he was an honorable man. So he's not known for vindictive behavior, Margaret mused. That could work in our favor. If we can make it clear that we're aware of his personal motivations, but offer him a way to save face while getting his money back, he might be willing to negotiate. Thomas looked at her with growing respect. You really think like a businesswoman. I had good teachers, Margaret said with a sad smile. My father was a merchant before he died, and Richard, for all his faults, was actually quite clever about financial strategy when he wasn't gambling it all away. A soft knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Thomas tensed immediately, clearly uncomfortable with the prospect of being seen by anyone else. That's probably Rosa checking to see if you need anything, he said, moving toward the back of the cabin. Thomas, wait, Margaret said. If we're going to be partners, you can't hide every time someone appears. Rosa works for you. She's seen you countless times. That's different, Thomas protested. Rosa and her family depend on the ranch for their livelihood. They have to accept me. Margaret opened the door before Thomas could retreat further. Rosa stood on the porch holding a pot of coffee and wearing an expression of motherly concern. Pardon, I heard voices and thought you might like some coffee, Rosa said, glancing between Thomas and Margaret with sharp eyes that missed nothing. That's very thoughtful, Rosa, Margaret said, stepping aside to let the older woman enter. We've been having quite a long conversation. Rosa set the coffee pot on the table and began arranging cups with practiced efficiency. See, I could hear you talking about business. This is good. She looked directly at Thomas, who was standing stiffly in the shadows. Senator Thomas, you need someone who understands numbers and money. The ranch, she is too good to lose. Rosa, I don't know if Miss O'Sullivan will be staying, Thomas said carefully. Of course she stays, Rosa said matter-of-factly, as if the question were ridiculous. She is here, you need help, she can give help. This is simple. Margaret smiled at the older woman's practical wisdom. Rosa, can I ask you something? How long have you and your family worked for Mr. Whitmore? Since before the fire, Rosa replied. My Manuel, he helped build the barn that burned. My sons, they work the cattle. This ranch is our home too. And if the ranch is foreclosed? Rosa's expression grew troubled. We look for other work, but double quotes, she shrugged eloquently. Not so easy to find a patron who treats workers like family. Margaret exchanged a meaningful look with Thomas. The stakes weren't just personal. Several families depended on the ranch's survival. Rosa, Margaret said carefully, what would you think if Mr. Whitmore and I were to marry? Not for love, but as a business arrangement to help save the ranch. Rosa's weathered face broke into a broad smile. Signora, I think you are a very smart woman. Love, she can grow from respect and working together. But first, you save what is important, no? That's very wise, Margaret agreed. Rosa turned to Thomas, her expression becoming stern. And you, Senator Thomas, you stop hiding like a rabbit in a hole. This lady, she sees past the scars to the good man underneath. You insult her intelligence when you think she cannot handle the truth of your face. Thomas's mouth opened in surprise at Rosa's directness, but the cook wasn't finished. Signora Margaret, Rosa continued, he is a good man with a good heart. The fire, she changed his face but not his character. You work together, you save the ranch, and maybe you find that partnership can become something more, see? With that pronouncement, Rosa gathered the empty cups and headed for the door. I leave you to talk more business. But remember the bank, she wants an answer soon. No time for too much thinking. After Rosa left, Thomas and Margaret sat in silence for a moment, processing the cook's blunt wisdom. "She's right about the timing," Thomas said finally. "Mitchell has given me until October 31st to pay the full amount. That's exactly 6 weeks from today. Then we don't have time for lengthy deliberations," Margaret agreed. "Thomas, I need you to make a decision. Are you willing to try this partnership? Not because you're desperate or because you think you owe me something, but because you genuinely believe we might be able to work together effectively?" Thomas studied her face in the lamplight, taking in her steady gaze and determined expression. "What happens if we fail? If we can't save the ranch despite our best efforts? Then we fail together," Margaret said simply. "But at least we'll have tried with everything we had instead of just accepting defeat." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, and Margaret could almost see him weighing possibilities, calculating risks, fighting against years of self-imposed isolation and defeat. Finally, he extended his scarred hand toward her. "Partners?" Margaret grasped his hand firmly, feeling the rough skin and missing fingers that told the story of his survival. "Partners." Outside, the wind picked up, rustling through the aspen trees with a sound like whispered promises. Neither Thomas nor Margaret was naive enough to believe their partnership would be easy, but for the first time in months, both felt the stirring of genuine hope. Tomorrow, they would begin the hard work of saving the ranch and building something new from the ashes of their separate defeats. Tonight, they had taken the first crucial step, choosing to trust each other with their futures. Dawn broke crisp and clear over the Broken Arrow Ranch, and Margaret woke to the sound of cattle lowing in the distance and the rhythmic thud of an axe splitting wood. She had slept better than she had in months, perhaps because for the first time since leaving Boston, she had a clear purpose and plan of action. After washing and dressing in her most practical brown wool dress, Margaret made her way to the main house. Thomas had given her permission to use his office to begin organizing their financial strategy, and she was eager to examine the ranch's books in detail. The main house was even more impressive in daylight than it had appeared the evening before. The great room featured a massive stone fireplace, hand-hewn timber beams, and large windows that offered sweeping views of the valley. But Margaret's trained eye noticed the subtle signs of a household without a woman's touch: dust on surfaces that should have been polished, curtains that needed mending, furniture arranged for function rather than comfort. She found Thomas's office at the back of the house, a masculine room lined with ledgers and dominated by a heavy oak desk. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating stacks of correspondence, bills, and legal documents. Margaret rolled up her sleeves and began the methodical work of understanding exactly what they were dealing with. The financial picture was both better and worse than she had expected. The ranch's operational income was strong. Thomas had been conservative in his estimates of what the cattle and horses were worth. However, the debt situation was more complex than a simple bank loan. There were also outstanding bills to suppliers, wages owed to seasonal workers, and equipment purchases that had been financed separately. Margaret was deep in calculations when Thomas appeared in the doorway, carrying a breakfast tray. She looked up to find him studying her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Rosa insisted I bring this to you," he said, setting the tray on a cleared corner of the desk. "She said women need proper food to think clearly about business." "That's very kind," Margaret replied, realizing she was indeed hungry. "I've been going through your records. You're an excellent bookkeeper, by the way. Everything is meticulously documented." Thomas moved closer to see what she was examining, though he kept his scarred side angled away from her. "My father drilled into me that a rancher who doesn't know his numbers down to the penny won't be a rancher for long." "Smart man," Margaret agreed, indicating the columns of figures she had been analyzing. "Based on what I can see here, you're in a much stronger position than you think. Your operational margins are actually quite healthy. But the debt is manageable if we approach it strategically, Margaret interrupted. The key is not letting emotion drive our decisions. Look at this. She turned the ledger toward him, pointing to specific entries. Your cattle sales for the past 3 years have been consistently profitable. Your breeding program is producing superior stock. You have valuable contracts with suppliers in Denver and even some buyers as far east as Kansas City. Thomas leaned over her shoulder to examine the figures, and Margaret caught the scent of leather and pine soap. I hadn't thought to present it that way to the bank. That's because you've been thinking like a debtor instead of like a businessman, Margaret said gently. When I had to negotiate with Richard's creditors, I learned that banks would much rather work with a profitable operation than foreclose on a failed one. Foreclosure is expensive and time-consuming, and banks aren't in the business of running cattle ranches. She pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began sketching a proposal outline. What we need to do is present Mitchell with a comprehensive business plan that shows him exactly how and when he'll get his money back, with interest. We demonstrate that the ranch is a going concern worth preserving. You think he'll listen? Thomas asked doubtfully. I think he's a banker first, and Sarah's father second, Margaret replied. If we can make it financially advantageous for him to work with us rather than against us, he'll at least consider it. They spent the morning working side by side, developing a detailed financial projection that showed how the ranch could not only pay off the existing debt, but also provide steady returns going forward. Margaret's questions pushed Thomas to think about aspects of his operation he had never analyzed in depth. What about expanding the horse breeding program? She suggested, reviewing his records of horse sales. Your prices are consistently higher than the market average, which suggests you're producing superior animals. The horses take longer to mature than cattle, Thomas explained, and they require more specialized care. I've kept the program small because I wasn't sure I could manage a larger operation alone. But you wouldn't be alone, Margaret pointed out. With a partner to handle the business side, you could focus more on the breeding and training aspects. Thomas paused in his writing, giving her a searching look. You really see this as a long-term partnership, don't you? I see it as an opportunity for both of us to build something significant, Margaret replied honestly. You have the expertise and the land. I have the business connections and financial skills. Together, we could create something neither of us could achieve alone. There. Conversation was interrupted by Daniel Crawford's arrival. The young foreman appeared in the office doorway with his hat in his hands and a worried expression on his face. Sorry to bother you, Mr. Whitmore, but we've got a situation with the cattle in the north pasture. Looks like someone cut the fence. Wire during the night. Thomas immediately tensed. Cut wire? You're sure it wasn't just broken? Clean cut, sir. Someone used wire cutters. About 20 head wandered onto Mitchell's property before we noticed. Margaret saw Thomas's jaw clench and understood immediately. This wasn't random vandalism, was it? Probably not, Thomas admitted grimly. There have been ... incidents since the loan dispute began. Nothing I could prove, but small problems that cost time and money. Daniel nodded confirmation. Tools going missing, gates left open, that kind of thing. This is the first time it's been actual property damage, though. Margaret felt a surge of anger on behalf of both Thomas and his workers. Mitchell is trying to make your operation look unreliable and unprofitable. What do you want me to do about the cattle? Daniel asked. I'll come with you to collect them, Thomas said, reaching for his hat. No, Margaret said firmly. I'll go. Both men stared at her in surprise. Margaret, you can't seriously think, Thomas began. I can and I do, she interrupted. Thomas, if you show up on Mitchell's property, it plays right into his hands. He can claim you're trespassing or being confrontational. But if I go say a woman, new to the area, obviously trying to handle a difficult situation diplomatically, It puts him in the position of having to be a gentleman. Thomas shook his head. It's too risky. You don't know how to handle cattle, and Mitchell might not be reasonable. Then Daniel will handle the cattle while I handle Mitchell, Margaret said practically. Unless you have a better plan? Thomas looked frustrated but couldn't argue with her logic. At least take Manuel with you. And if Mitchell becomes hostile, you leave immediately. Agreed, Margaret said, already moving toward the door. Daniel, how long will it take to saddle a horse for me? You can ride? Daniel asked, clearly surprised. I may be from Boston, but my father believed ladies should be capable of managing themselves in various circumstances, Margaret replied. With a slight smile. An hour later, Margaret found herself riding across the rangeland toward the Mitchell property, accompanied by Daniel, Manuel, and 2 other ranch hands. She had borrowed a divided riding skirt from Rosa and felt surprisingly comfortable on horseback, despite having had limited opportunity to ride in recent years. The Mitchell Ranch was visible across the valley, a sprawling operation clearly generated significant wealth. The house was larger than Thomas's, with multiple outbuildings and extensive corrals. Margaret could see the Broken Arrow cattle grazing peacefully near a creek that marked the property boundary. There's Mr. Mitchell, Daniel said, pointing to a man on horseback who was approaching from the direction of the main house. James Mitchell was a man in his 50s, well-dressed and prosperous-looking, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. He rode up to their group with an expression of mild curiosity that didn't quite hide his underlying tension. Good morning, Margaret said pleasantly, guiding her horse forward. I'm Margaret O'Sullivan. I believe you know Mr. Crawford from the Broken Arrow Ranch. Mitchell's eyes narrowed slightly as he processed her introduction. Miss O'Sullivan. I heard there was a young woman visiting Whitmore Place. I'm Mr. Whitmore's business partner, Margaret replied smoothly, not bothering to correct his assumption. About her marital status. I'm afraid we've had some trouble with our fence line, and a few of our cattle have wandered onto your property. We've come to collect them and repair any damage they may have caused. Mitchell's expression grew more guarded. Business partner? Yes, I'm helping Mr. Whitmore restructure his operations to ensure maximum profitability, Margaret said, maintaining her pleasant tone while watching Mitchell's face carefully. In fact, I was hoping to have the opportunity to speak with you about some financial matters. I don't conduct bank business in the middle of a pasture, Mitchell said curtly. Of course not, Margaret agreed. But perhaps you could spare a few minutes for a preliminary discussion? I believe you'll find our proposal quite interesting from a business perspective. Margaret could see Mitchell weighing his options. His curiosity about what she might propose was clearly at war with his desire to avoid anything that might help Thomas. What kind of proposal? He asked finally. Margaret gestured toward the cattle, which Daniel and the other men were already beginning to gather. Mr. Whitmore's ranch has been consistently profitable for the past 3 years, even accounting for the challenges following his accident. We believe the current debt situation is a temporary setback that can be resolved through strategic planning rather than foreclosure. The loan terms were clear when it was made, Mitchell said stiffly. Absolutely, Margaret agreed. And we intend to honor them completely. Our proposal simply involves a structured payment plan that ensures you receive the full amount owed plus interest while allowing the ranch to maintain the operational capacity necessary to generate that income. Mitchell looked skeptical. Whitmore's had months to come up with a payment plan. Mr. Whitmore has been focused on day-to-day operations. Margaret replied diplomatically. Sometimes it takes a fresh perspective to identify opportunities that weren't immediately obvious. She pulled a folded document from her jacket pocket. I've prepared a preliminary analysis that demonstrates the ranch's financial viability. If you're willing to review it, I believe you'll find that restructuring the debt serves both parties' interests better than foreclosure. Mitchell accepted the document, but didn't open it immediately. And what exactly is your background, Miss O'Sullivan? that qualifies you to make such assessments? Margaret had anticipated this question. I spent several years working with commercial lending operations in Boston before coming west. I've seen both successful debt restructures and costly foreclosures from the bank's perspective. It wasn't entirely a lie. She had indeed observed such transactions while dealing with Richard's financial problems, and she had learned a great deal about banking practices in the process. Mitchell studied her for a long moment, then glanced at the document in his hand. "I'll review this," he said finally. "But I make no promises about changing the loan terms." "That's all we ask," Margaret replied. "A fair review based on financial merit." By the time they had finished collecting the cattle and returned to the Broken Arrow, word of Margaret's diplomatic mission had spread through the ranch. Thomas was waiting anxiously in the yard, and Margaret could see the relief in his face when their group appeared with all the cattle accounted for. "How did it go?" he asked as she dismounted. "Better than expected," Margaret replied, accepting his hand to help her down from the horse. "Mitchell agreed to review our financial proposal. He wasn't enthusiastic, but he also wasn't openly hostile." "Did he say anything about the cut fence?" "I didn't mention it directly," Margaret said. "I thought it was better to focus on the future, rather than relitigate past grievances." Thomas nodded approvingly. That was smart thinking. As they walked toward the house, Margaret felt a sense of satisfaction that had nothing to do with the business aspects of their mission. She had handled herself competently in an unfamiliar situation, and more importantly, she had seen a new side of Thomas's character. His concern for her safety during the confrontation with Mitchell had been genuine and touching, revealing a protective instinct that went beyond mere partnership obligations. That evening, as they reviewed the day's events over dinner in the main house, Margaret found herself studying Thomas more closely. Away from the emotional intensity of their first night's conversations, she could appreciate the intelligence behind his careful questions and the quiet strength in the way he managed his ranch hands. "I've been thinking about the horse breeding program," Thomas said, refilling her coffee cup. "If Mitchell agrees to restructure the debt, we might be able to expand more quickly than I originally planned." "What would that involve?" Margaret asked. "Acquiring some additional breeding stock, maybe hiring a trainer who specializes in working with the better bloodlines. The profit margins on trained horses are significantly higher than on cattle." Margaret smiled at the enthusiasm creeping into his voice. This was the first time she had heard him speak about the future with genuine optimism instead of resignation. "There's something else," Thomas continued, his tone becoming more serious. "If we're going to be married, even as a business arrangement, there are certain practical considerations we need to address." Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Such as?" "Living arrangements, for one thing. It would look strange if my wife continued to live in the guest cabin. People would talk, and that kind of speculation could undermine our credibility with potential business partners." He was right, of course, but the implications made Margaret's heart race. "What do you suggest?" "The main house has several bedrooms. You could have your own private space, but we'd need to present the appearance of a conventional marriage to the outside world." Margaret nodded, trying to keep her voice steady. "That makes sense from a practical standpoint. And there would need to be some kind of ceremony," Thomas added. "Nothing elaborate, but something official enough to satisfy legal requirements and community expectations." The conversation was becoming increasingly real, and Margaret found herself both excited and terrified by the prospect. What had begun as a desperate business arrangement was starting to feel like something much more significant. "Thomas," she said carefully, "I want to make sure we're both clear about what we're agreeing to. This partnership, this marriage, what exactly are your expectations?" Thomas was quiet for a moment, his scarred face thoughtful in the lamplight. "Honestly, I don't know. I've never been in a situation like this before. I suppose we'll have to figure it out as we go along." Margaret found his honesty both refreshing and unsettling. They were about to commit to a legal bond with no clear understanding of where it might lead. A leap of faith that would have terrified the cautious woman she had been in Boston. But that woman had lost everything by playing it safe and trusting the wrong person. Perhaps it was time to try a different approach. 3 weeks into October, Margaret and Thomas had settled into a rhythm of partnership that surprised them both with its efficiency. Margaret had moved into the main house, taking the large bedroom at the end of the hall, while Thomas remained in the master suite. Their arrangement was scrupulously proper, but the shared meals and long evening discussions about ranch business had created an intimacy neither had expected. The financial restructuring proposal had been refined and submitted to Mitchell's bank, complete with projected cash flows, asset valuations, and a detailed repayment schedule. They had received no response, which Margaret interpreted as cautiously positive. Outright rejection would have come quickly. On this particular morning, Margaret was in the kitchen working on correspondence with potential investors in Denver, when Daniel burst through the back door, his face grim with urgency. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, using the title they had agreed upon for appearances, "you need to come quickly. There's been trouble at the South Pasture." Margaret immediately set down her pen. Over the past weeks, she had learned to read the subtle signs that distinguished minor ranch problems from serious crises. Daniel's expression indicated the latter. "What kind of trouble?" she asked, already reaching for her riding jacket. "Someone poisoned the water hole. We've lost 12 head of cattle so far, and more are sick." Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. 12 head of cattle represented several $100s in immediate losses, but more importantly, it was a direct attack on their ability to demonstrate the ranch's viability to Mitchell. "Where's Thomas?" she asked. "He's down there, with Manuel and the others, trying to save what cattle he can. He sent me to fetch you because ... double quotes. Daniel hesitated. "Because what?" "Because Sheriff Harrison is there, and he's asking questions about who might have done this. Thomas thought you should be present for any official discussions." Margaret nodded grimly. She had been expecting escalation in Mitchell's campaign against the ranch, but poisoning water sources was beyond harassment. It was a serious crime that could destroy their entire operation if it continued. The ride to the South Pasture took 20 minutes across rough terrain. Margaret could smell the sickly sweet odor of death before she could see the scene. Several cattle lay motionless near the water hole, while others stood nearby, clearly distressed and refusing to drink. Thomas was kneeling beside one of the fallen animals with Dr. Peterson, the veterinarian from town. His face was set in lines of controlled fury that Margaret had never seen before. Sheriff Harrison, a tall man with graying hair and a weathered face, stood nearby taking notes. "Mrs. Whitmore," Sheriff Harrison said as Margaret approached. "I understand you're Mr. Whitmore's business partner." "That's correct," Margaret replied, dismounting and moving to stand beside Thomas. "What have you determined about the cause of this?" Dr. Peterson looked up from his examination. "Definitely poison. Looks like someone dumped a large quantity of arsenic-based rat poison into the water source. Probably happened sometime during the night." "Arsenic," Margaret repeated, her mind immediately calculating the implications. "That's not something that would be accidentally introduced." "No, ma'am," Sheriff Harrison agreed. "This was deliberate. Question is, who would want to harm your operation, and why?" Margaret exchanged a careful look with Thomas. They both knew who the most likely suspect was, but accusations without proof would only make their situation worse. "Sheriff," Thomas said, his voice carefully controlled, "we've had several incidents over the past month. Cut fences, missing tools, gates left open. This is just the most serious escalation." "You think someone's targeting your ranch specifically?" "It seems likely," Margaret said diplomatically. "We can't think of any reason for random vandalism to focus so consistently on our property. Sheriff Harrison made more notes. Any enemies? Business disputes? Personal conflicts? Thomas's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Nothing that would justify this level of criminal activity. Margaret admired his restraint, but she could see the sheriff wasn't satisfied with such vague answers. Before Harrison could press further, the sound of approaching horses drew everyone's attention. James Mitchell rode up with two of his ranch hands, his expression carefully composed in lines of neighborly concern. "Sheriff Harrison," Mitchell called out as he dismounted. "I heard there was trouble over here. Thought I should check if there's anything I can do to help." Margaret felt Thomas tense beside her. Mitchell's arrival was suspiciously well-timed for someone who claimed to have just heard about the incident. "Appreciate the offer, Mr. Mitchell," Sheriff Harrison replied. "Someone poisoned the water source here, killed a dozen head of cattle." Mitchell's face showed appropriate shock and concern. "Good Lord, that's a serious attack on someone's livelihood. Any idea who might be responsible?" "That's what we're trying to determine," the sheriff said, studying Mitchell's face carefully. "You haven't noticed any strangers in the area? Anyone who might have access to large quantities of poison?" "Nothing out of the ordinary," Mitchell replied. "Though I have to say, this kind of thing makes all us ranchers nervous. If someone's willing to poison water sources, none of our operations are safe." Margaret recognized the subtle manipulation in Mitchell's words, positioning himself as a potential victim rather than a suspect, while simultaneously planting the idea that the Broken Arrow Ranch attracted dangerous criminal activity. "Mr. Mitchell," she said pleasantly, "since you're here, perhaps you could help us understand something. We've been having these incidents for several weeks now, always at times when your ranch hands might have noticed unusual activity. Have any of your men reported seeing strangers on or near your property?" Mitchell's eyes narrowed slightly at her direct approach. "I'm afraid not, Mrs. Whitmore. My men are usually focused on our own operations." "Of course," Margaret agreed. "It's just that from our south pasture, there's a clear line of sight to several of your work areas. Anyone approaching our water source would have to cross land that's visible from your property." Sheriff Harrison looked between Margaret and Mitchell with growing interest. "That's a good point, Mrs. Whitmore. Mr. Mitchell, would you mind having your foreman ask around? See if anyone noticed unusual activity last night?" "Certainly," Mitchell replied, but his tone had grown noticeably cooler. "Though I should point out that my men aren't responsible for monitoring the Whitmore property." "No one's suggesting they are," Thomas said, speaking for the first time since Mitchell's arrival. "We're just trying to gather all available information." The tension between the two men was palpable, and Margaret could see Sheriff Harrison picking up on the undercurrents he didn't fully understand. "Well," the sheriff said finally, "I'll need to file a report and send word to the territorial authorities. Poisoning livestock is a federal offense if it crosses property lines or affects interstate commerce." Margaret saw Mitchell's face tighten, almost imperceptibly at the mention of federal involvement. After the sheriff and Mitchell departed, Thomas, Margaret, and the ranch hands were left to deal with the immediate crisis. The dead cattle had to be disposed of properly to prevent further contamination. The water source had to be cleaned and tested, and the surviving cattle needed to be moved to alternative grazing areas. This sets us back at least 2 weeks in. "Our timeline for Mitchell's loan payment," Thomas said grimly as they supervised the cleanup efforts. "Maybe that was the point," Margaret replied. "If we can't demonstrate consistent profitability because we're constantly dealing with sabotage, Mitchell has justification for refusing to restructure the debt." That evening, as they sat in Thomas's office reviewing the financial impact of the day's losses, Margaret noticed Thomas struggling with something beyond mere business concerns. "What is it?" she asked gently. Thomas set down his pen and rubbed his scarred face wearily. "I keep thinking that if I were a different man, if I could show my face in town, conduct business normally, this wouldn't be happening. Mitchell wouldn't." Feel so confident about attacking us if I were there to defend what's ours. Margaret felt her heart clench at the self-recrimination in his voice. Thomas, this isn't about your appearance. This is about a vindictive man abusing his power, is it? Thomas challenged. Or is it about a man who knows I'm too damaged to fight back effectively? Margaret stood and moved around the desk to face him directly. Listen to me carefully. What happened today was the act of a criminal who's desperate because our partnership is working. We've presented him with a proposal he can't dismiss on purely financial grounds. So he's resorting to sabotage to create problems he can point to as justification for foreclosure. You don't know that for certain, Thomas said, don't I? Margaret pulled out the chair beside him and sat down. Thomas, I've seen this kind of escalation before. When Richard's creditors realized I was going to successfully challenge their claims, they got more aggressive and desperate. Desperation makes people take foolish risks. What kind of risks? Margaret's eyes gleamed with the strategic thinking that had helped her survive Boston's financial predators. Mitchell made 3 critical mistakes today. First, he arrived at the scene too quickly for someone who supposedly just heard about the incident. Second, he tried too hard to position himself as a potential victim. Third, he showed detailed knowledge about our property boundaries and sightlines that most neighbors wouldn't have. Thomas looked at her with growing respect. You think Sheriff Harrison noticed those things? I think Sheriff Harrison is more observant than he lets on, Margaret replied. But more importantly, I think Mitchell's going to make more mistakes because he's getting desperate. Our proposal forced him to realize that legal foreclosure might not be possible, so he's trying to create grounds for it. So what do we do? Margaret smiled, and Thomas was struck by how much determination could transform her entire demeanor. We set a trap. Over the next hour, Margaret outlined a plan that was both elegant and risky. They would use Mitchell's apparent inside knowledge against him by feeding him false information about their most valuable assets and then monitoring what happened. We'll let word slip in town that we're moving our prize breeding horses to a new location tomorrow night, Margaret explained. But we'll actually move them tonight and set up surveillance on the supposedly vulnerable location. That could be dangerous, Thomas warned. If Mitchell's people show up expecting to find valuable horses and find us instead, the situation could turn violent. Which is why we'll have Sheriff Harrison positioned nearby, Margaret replied. We can't prove Mitchell's involvement in the poisoning, but if we catch his people in the act of trying to steal or harm our livestock, we'll have evidence of a pattern of criminal activity. Thomas studied her face in the lamplight, noting the combination of intelligence and courage that had drawn him to respect her more with each passing day. Margaret, if this goes wrong, it could cost us everything. Not just the ranch, but potentially our lives. And if we do nothing, Mitchell will continue escalating until he succeeds in destroying us anyway, Margaret pointed out. At least this way, we're taking control of the situation instead of just reacting to his attacks. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, weighing the risks against their increasingly desperate circumstances. Finally, he reached across the desk and took her hand. Partners? He asked, echoing the question from their first night. Partners, Margaret confirmed, squeezing his scarred fingers firmly. The next evening, Margaret found herself crouched behind a fallen log near the horse corral, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Thomas was positioned on the other side of the clearing, and Sheriff Harrison was hidden with 2 deputies in the tree line beyond. They had spent the day carefully spreading word in town about the valuable horses that would be vulnerable in the South Corral overnight. The plan seemed almost too simple to work, but Margaret had learned that desperate people often fell for straightforward traps. Mitchell's need to strike a devastating blow against their operation might override his usual caution. Hours passed in tense silence. Margaret was beginning to wonder if they had misjudged Mitchell's intentions when she heard the soft sound of horses approaching. 3 riders materialized out of the darkness, moving cautiously toward the corral. Margaret's breath caught as she recognized one of the figures. It was Mitchell himself, not just his hired hands. The banker had apparently decided that this sabotage was too important to delegate. She watched as the men dismounted and began examining the corral, clearly looking for the horses they expected to find. When they discovered the enclosure was empty, their voices carried clearly in the still night air. "Where the hell are they?" one man hissed. "Maybe the information was wrong," another suggested. Mitchell's voice was unmistakable in the darkness. "No, they moved them earlier than planned. We'll have to find where they're being kept now." Margaret felt a surge of triumph. Mitchell had just admitted to acting on inside information about their ranch operations, information he could only have obtained through surveillance or bribery. "Should we check the other corrals?" one of the men asked. "No," Mitchell said grimly. "This was our best chance. If we can't hit them hard enough to force immediate bankruptcy, the federal investigation into the poisoning might start causing problems." Margaret's eyes widened. Mitchell had just confessed to the cattle poisoning within earshot of a sheriff and 2 deputies. Sheriff Harrison's voice suddenly boomed out of the darkness. "This is Sheriff Harrison. You men are under arrest for trespassing and conspiracy to commit livestock theft. Put your hands where I can see them." The next few minutes were a chaos of shouting, running figures, and the sound of men crashing through underbrush. One of Mitchell's accomplices managed to escape in the darkness, but Mitchell himself and the other man were quickly apprehended by the deputies. As Sheriff Harrison placed Mitchell in handcuffs, the banker's face was a mask of fury and disbelief. "This is entrapment," he snarled. "You can't prove anything." "Actually, Mr. Mitchell," Sheriff Harrison replied calmly, "we heard you confess to poisoning cattle, which is a federal crime. We also have 3 witnesses to your attempted theft of livestock. I'd say we can prove quite a lot." Margaret and Thomas emerged from their hiding places as the deputies prepared to transport the prisoners back to town. In the moonlight, Margaret could see that Thomas's face showed a mixture of relief, satisfaction, and something else, a new confidence that came from having successfully fought back against the forces that had been destroying his life. "Well, Mrs. Whitmore," Sheriff Harrison said with a slight smile, "I have to admit your plan worked better than I expected. Mitchell just solved both our investigation problems and your debt problems in one evening." Margaret felt Thomas's hand slip into hers as they watched Mitchell being loaded onto a horse for the ride back to town. The immediate crisis was over, but she realized that its resolution had changed something fundamental between them. They had trusted each other with their lives and their futures, and both had proven worthy of that trust. Tomorrow would bring new challenges dealing with the bank's response to Mitchell's arrest, managing the ranch without the threat of constant sabotage, and navigating the changing dynamics of their partnership. But tonight, standing in the moonlight with Thomas's hand warm in hers, Margaret felt that they had crossed a threshold that could never be uncrossed. They were no longer just business partners united by necessity. They had become true allies, bound by shared risk and mutual respect. And maybe, Margaret thought as she looked at Thomas's profile in the silvery light, they were becoming something even more significant than that. The aftermath of Mitchell's arrest brought changes to the Broken Arrow Ranch that neither Tom nor Margaret had anticipated. Within 3 days, the territorial authorities had taken over the investigation, and by the end of the week, the bank's board of directors had voted to remove Mitchell from his position and restructure all questionable loans under federal oversight. Margaret stood at the kitchen window watching Thomas work with a new horse in the training corral. For the first time since she had arrived, he wasn't constantly looking over his shoulder or positioning himself to hide his scars. The successful confrontation with Mitchell seemed to have restored something essential in his character, a confidence that had been buried under months of shame and isolation. "Senora Margaret," Rosa said, setting a cup of coffee beside her. "You are thinking very serious thoughts this morning." "I'm thinking about how much has changed," Margaret replied, accepting the warm cup gratefully. "A month ago, Thomas barely left the ranch house. Now look at him." Rosa followed Margaret's gaze to where Thomas was patiently working with a spirited young stallion. "See, but it is not just the victory over Senator Mitchell that changed him. It is having someone who believes he is still a man worth respecting." Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. Over the past weeks, her feelings toward Thomas had evolved far beyond their original business arrangement, but she had been careful not to examine those changes too closely. Their partnership had been built on practical necessity, not romantic attachment. "Rosa, you know our marriage was arranged for business reasons," Margaret said carefully. "See, I know what you tell yourselves," Rosa replied with a knowing smile. "But I have eyes. I see how you look at each other when you think, no. One is watching. I see how he stands taller when you are proud of him. I see how you smile when he makes you laugh." Before Margaret could respond, Daniel's arrival interrupted their conversation. The young foreman approached the house with a letter in his hand and an expression of barely contained excitement. "Mrs. Whitmore," he called out, "this just came by special courier from Denver. Looks official." Margaret accepted the letter, noting the bank seal and the formal address. Her heart began to race as she broke the wax seal and unfolded the document inside out as she read. Her eyes widened with disbelief. "Rosa, they're not just restructuring the loan. They're offering to extend the terms at a reduced interest rate and provide additional credit for ranch improvements." "En serio?" Rosa exclaimed. "This is wonderful news." Margaret continued reading, her excitement growing with each line. "They want to establish the Broken Arrow as a model operation for the territory. They're offering to send agricultural specialists to help optimize our breeding programs and connect us with eastern markets for premium livestock." The sound of approaching footsteps made her look up to see Thomas walking toward the house, having apparently noticed the arrival of the courier. His shirt was damp with sweat from working with the horses, and dust covered his boots. But Margaret found herself thinking that he had never looked more attractive than he did at this moment, confident, capable, and thoroughly in his element. "What's the news?" Thomas asked, removing his hat and running his fingers through his hair. Margaret held out the letter, unable to keep the joy from her voice. "We did it, Thomas. Not only is the debt crisis over, but the bank wants to make us their flagship operation in Colorado Territory." Thomas took the letter and read it carefully, his expression shifting from cautious hope to amazement. This is ... This is more than I ever dreamed possible." "It's what you deserve," Margaret said firmly. "You built something extraordinary here, even before I arrived. All I did was help you see it clearly and present it effectively." Thomas looked up from the letter to meet her eyes. "Margaret, you saved everything. The ranch, my future, probably my sanity. I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to thank me," Margaret replied. "We're partners, remember? Your success is my success." But even as she said the words, Margaret realized that their original partnership agreement now felt inadequate to describe what existed between them. The business crisis that had brought them together was resolved, which meant the practical necessity that had justified their arrangement no longer existed. Thomas seemed to be having similar thoughts. "Margaret, we need to talk about what happens. Now our agreement was based on saving the ranch from foreclosure. Now that the crisis is over, we need to decide what we really want." Margaret finished quietly. They were interrupted by the arrival of Father Miguel, the traveling priest who served the scattered ranch communities throughout the territory. Margaret had sent word to him weeks earlier about performing their marriage ceremony, but with all the recent drama, she had forgotten that he was expected. "Senator Whitmore, Senora Margaret," Father Miguel called out in accented English as he climbed down from his wagon. "I have come to perform the wedding ceremony as requested." Margaret and Thomas exchanged startled looks. In the aftermath of Mitchell's arrest and the resolution of their financial crisis, the question of their marriage had become much more complicated. "Father Miguel," Thomas said carefully, "there have been some developments since we sent that message. We may need to postpone." "Nonsense," Rosa interrupted firmly, emerging from the house with a determined expression. "You two have been dancing around your feelings for weeks. Padre Miguel is here, the paperwork is ready, and everyone on the ranch has been looking forward to the celebration." "Rosa," Margaret began, "it's not that simple. Thomas and I need to discuss." "What is there to discuss?" Rosa demanded. "You care for each other, see? You work well together, see? You want to build a life together, see? Then what else matters?" Father Miguel looked between the three of them with the patient expression of a man who had officiated at many complicated frontier marriages. "Perhaps we should speak privately," he suggested. "Matters of the heart are not always simple to resolve." An hour later, Margaret found herself sitting across from Father Miguel in Thomas's office while Thomas paced near the window. The priest had listened carefully to their explanation of the business arrangement, the crisis they had faced together, and their current uncertainty about the future. "Let me understand," Father Miguel said thoughtfully. "You entered into this arrangement for practical reasons, but during your partnership, you have developed genuine feelings for each other." "It's not that straightforward," Margaret replied. "Our entire relationship has been built on necessity and mutual benefit. Now that those external pressures are gone, we don't know if what we feel is real or just convenience." Thomas stopped pacing and turned to face them. "Margaret's right. We've been through so much together that it's difficult to separate genuine affection from gratitude and shared crisis bonding." Father Miguel nodded understandingly. "This is a common challenge in frontier marriages. Many couples begin with practical arrangements and develop love over time. The question is not whether your feelings began with necessity, but whether they can grow into something deeper and more lasting." "But how do we know?" Margaret asked. "How do we distinguish between partnership and love?" "By being honest about what you want your future to look like," Father Miguel replied. "Not what you think you should want, not what circumstances have forced upon you, but what would bring you genuine happiness and fulfillment." The priest stood and moved toward the door. "I will give you time to consider this question. If you decide to proceed with the ceremony, I will be honored to officiate. If you decide to wait, or to dissolve your arrangement entirely, I will support that decision as well. But I encourage you to be completely honest with each other about your feelings." After Father Miguel left, Thomas and Margaret sat in uncomfortable silence for several minutes. The office felt smaller somehow, charged with unspoken emotions and possibilities. "Margaret," Thomas said finally, "I need to tell you something. These past weeks, working with you, seeing how you handled every challenge we faced, I've come to care for you in ways I never expected." Margaret's heart began to race, but she forced herself to respond carefully. "Thomas, we've been through intense experiences together. It's natural to feel close to someone who's been through so much with you. Is that all you think this is?" Thomas asked, moving closer to her chair. "Shared trauma creating artificial intimacy?" Margaret looked up at him, taking in the hopeful uncertainty in his eyes. "I don't know. How can we know? We've never had the luxury of normal courtship, of getting to know each other without crisis and necessity driving every interaction." Thomas knelt beside her chair, bringing them to eye level. "Then let's create that luxury now. The ranch is secure, the debt is resolved, we have time and stability. What if we started over? Not as desperate partners forced together by circumstances, but as two people choosing to explore what might be possible between us." "Start over?" Margaret repeated. "Court properly," Thomas clarified. "Give ourselves the chance to fall in love instead of just falling into partnership. See if what we feel in calm moments is as strong as what we felt during the crises." "Margaret." studied his face, noting how the afternoon light caught the scarred side differently than the unmarked side, creating a map of survival and strength rather than damage. And if we discover that what we felt was just circumstantial, if we realize we're better as business partners than as married couples, then we'll know, Thomas said simply. But Margaret, I'd rather risk discovering that we're not meant for each other than spend the rest of my life wondering what we might have been. Margaret felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. Thomas, I need to tell you something too. That first night, when you told me about Caroline's deception, I was angry and hurt. But these past weeks, watching you work, seeing your kindness, with the ranch hands, witnessing your integrity even when dealing with Mitchell, I've fallen in love with who you are, not who I thought you were going to be. Thomas's face lit up with wonder and joy. You love me? I love your intelligence and your dedication to this ranch, Margaret said, her voice growing stronger with each word. I love your patience with the horses and your loyalty to your employees. I love how you think through problems carefully, and how you've never once treated me as anything less than an equal partner. I love your courage, even when you don't think you're being brave. Thomas reached up to cup her face gently in his scarred hands. Margaret, do you love me despite my scars, or can you love me including them? Margaret covered his hands with hers, holding them against her cheeks. Thomas, your scars are part of your story. They're proof that you survived something terrible and chose to keep living. They're evidence of your strength, not your weakness. I don't love you despite them. I love you, all of you, scars included. And I love you, Thomas whispered, for your courage in coming here, for your intelligence in saving everything I thought was lost, for your determination to see possibilities instead of just problems. I love how you challenge me to be better than I thought I could be. Margaret felt her heart soar as Thomas leaned forward and kissed her gently. This kiss was different from any romantic moment she had imagined during their practical discussions of marriage. It was tender and hesitant and full of promise for a future they would build together by choice rather than necessity. When they broke apart, Margaret smiled through her tears. So what do we do now? Father Miguel is waiting for an answer. Thomas smiled back, and Margaret realized it was the first completely unguarded, joyful expression she had seen from him since her arrival. Now we go tell him that we're ready to be married, not because we have to, but because we want to. Are you sure? Margaret asked. We could wait, take time to court properly like you suggested. Thomas shook his head. I've spent 2 years hiding from life, letting fear and shame make my decisions for me. I don't want to waste any more time being cautious when I could be building something beautiful with you. Margaret stood and moved into his arms, feeling the rightness of being held by this man who had become so much more than a business partner. Then let's go tell Rosa she can start planning a celebration. As they walked hand in hand toward the door, Margaret reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought them to this moment. She had come west seeking security and acceptance from a stranger. Instead, she had found love with a man who saw her true worth and partnership with someone who challenged her to be stronger than she had ever imagined possible. Thomas, she said as they reached the porch where Father Miguel, Rosa, and several ranch hands were waiting expectantly, I have one more confession to make. What's that? I'm terrified and excited and completely certain that this is exactly where I belong. Thomas squeezed her hand and smiled. Mrs. Whitmore, I couldn't agree more. The sound of Rosa's delighted exclamation and Father Miguel's approving chuckle filled the air as Thomas and Margaret announced their decision to the gathered group. But Margaret barely heard the congratulations and excited planning that followed. She was too busy marveling at how a journey that had begun with deception and desperation had led to a truth more beautiful than any fiction Caroline could have invented in her letters. Love, it turned out, was indeed the greatest partnership of all. The morning of their wedding dawned crisp and golden, with the kind of crystalline autumn air that made the Rocky Mountains look close enough to touch. Margaret woke in her bedroom at the main house for the last time as a single woman, sunlight streaming through the lace curtains that Rosa had insisted on hanging for the occasion. Over the past week, the entire ranch had transformed into a celebration venue. Word of Thomas and Margaret's love story had spread throughout the territory. The tale of the scarred rancher and the Boston woman who had saved each other had captured imaginations from Silver Creek to Denver. What had begun as a simple ceremony had evolved into a community celebration that would be talked about for years to come. Margaret rose and moved to her window, where she could see the bustling activity below. Daniel and Manuel were stringing lanterns between the oak trees, while Rosa directed a team of women from neighboring ranches who had come early to help with preparations. The aroma of roasting beef and baking bread drifted up from the outdoor cooking areas that had been set up near the barn. A soft knock at her door interrupted her observations. "Come in," she called, expecting Rosa with her morning coffee. Instead, a woman in an elegant traveling dress entered, carrying a garment bag and wearing a nervous smile. Margaret's breath caught as she recognized the visitor from the photograph on Thomas's mantel. "You must be Margaret," the woman said warmly. "I'm Carolyn Sutton, Thomas's sister. I hope you don't mind my arriving unannounced, but I couldn't miss my brother's wedding." Margaret felt a complex mixture of emotions: curiosity, gratitude, and a lingering uncertainty about the woman whose deception had brought them together. "Mrs. Sutton, we weren't expecting you." Carolyn set down the garment bag and turned to face Margaret fully. "I imagine you have mixed feelings about meeting me. After all, my interference created quite a complicated situation for both you and Thomas." "Your interference also saved both our lives," Margaret replied honestly, "though not in the way you originally intended." Carolyn smiled, and Margaret could see the family resemblance to Thomas in her intelligent eyes and determined chin. "I received Thomas's letter about everything that happened: Mitchell's crimes, your partnership, the way you fought to save the ranch together. I have to admit, the outcome far exceeded my most optimistic hopes." "Why did you do it?" Margaret asked directly. "Why create such an elaborate deception?" Carolyn moved to the window, looking out at the preparations below. "Because I watched my brother disappear after that fire. Not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually. The Thomas I knew was confident, engaged with the world, planning for the future. After the accident, he became a ghost haunting his own life." She turned back to Margaret, her expression serious. "I knew that if I simply told him about you, he would have refused to meet you. His self-pity had convinced him that no woman could ever see past his scars, so I took matters into my own hands." Margaret studied Caroline's face, recognizing the same protective instinct she had seen in Thomas. "You risked a great deal. What if we had been completely incompatible? What if the deception had destroyed any chance of trust between us? Then I would have helped you both pick up the pieces and try again," Carolyn replied simply. "But I had a feeling about you from your letters. Your strength, your resilience, your refusal to be defeated by circumstances. You reminded me of the women in our family. I thought if anyone could see the man Thomas still was underneath his pain, it would be you." Carolyn moved to the garment bag and began to unfasten it. "I brought you something. Consider it a wedding gift and an apology for the unconventional way our families have been joined." She withdrew a stunning wedding dress of ivory silk with intricate beadwork and delicate lace sleeves. "This was our mother's wedding dress and her mother's before that. I wore it when I married, and I had hoped... She paused, her voice catching slightly. "I had hoped Thomas's wife would wear it someday." Margaret reached out to touch the exquisite fabric, overwhelmed by the gesture. "Carolyn, I can't. This is a family heirloom, and I'm not really... You are family," Carolyn interrupted firmly. "From the moment you chose to stay and fight for Thomas and the ranch instead of running back to Boston, you became family. This dress has been worn by women who married for love, women who married for security, and women who married for partnership. But you're the first to marry for all three. Margaret felt tears gathering in her eyes as she fully grasped the significance of Caroline's gift. Are you sure Thomas will approve? Given everything that's happened with your creative correspondence? Caroline laughed, a sound so similar to Thomas's rare laughter that Margaret smiled involuntarily. Thomas forgave me the moment he realized that my scheming had brought him the love of his life. Besides, seeing you in our mother's dress will probably make him cry, and it's been far too long since my brother allowed himself to feel joy openly. 2 hours later, Margaret stood before the mirror in Caroline's expert hands, while Rosa fussed with the dress's intricate buttons. The gown fit as if it had been made for her, the silk flowing elegantly over her figure, while the beadwork caught the light with every movement. Perfecto, Rosa breathed, stepping back to admire their work. You look like a princess from one of those fairy tales. Margaret hardly recognized herself. The woman in the mirror bore little resemblance to the desperate, travel-worn person who had arrived at Silver Creek Station just 2 months earlier. This woman was radiant with confidence and happiness, her auburn hair arranged in an elegant style that showcased the pearl earrings that were her only remaining link to her life in Boston. Something's missing, Caroline mused, studying Margaret's reflection. She reached into her reticule and withdrew a delicate gold locket. This was Thomas's gift to me on my wedding day. He said every bride should have something to remind her that she's loved. Margaret accepted the locket with shaking hands, feeling the weight of family history and acceptance. Caroline, you've already given me so much ... You've given me back my brother, Caroline replied simply. The man who greeted me this morning was the Thomas I remember from before the fire, confident, happy, planning for the future. That transformation is worth more than any material gift. A commotion outside the window drew their attention. Through the lace curtains, they could see guests arriving from all directions, neighboring ranchers with their families, townspeople from Silver Creek, even some officials from Denver who had come to celebrate the success story of the Broken Arrow Ranch. Word travels fast in the territory, Rosa observed with satisfaction. Everyone wants to see the couple who defeated Senator Mitchell and saved their ranch through love and partnership. Margaret felt a flutter of nervousness as she realized the size of the gathering crowd. I didn't expect so many people. What if I say something wrong during the ceremony? What if I disappoint everyone's expectations? Caroline placed a reassuring hand on Margaret's shoulder. Margaret, these people aren't here to judge you. They're here to celebrate a story of hope and resilience that gives them faith in their own futures. You and Thomas represent the possibility that love and determination can overcome any obstacle. As the afternoon sun reached its peak, Margaret made her way toward the outdoor ceremony area on Daniel's arm. Thomas had insisted that his foreman should have the honor of escorting her, since Daniel had been the first person to welcome her to the ranch and had supported their partnership from the beginning. The ceremony area had been transformed into something magical. Chairs borrowed from every ranch in the county were arranged in neat rows, with an aisle marked by fallen aspen leaves in brilliant gold. At the front, Father Miguel waited beneath an arch woven from pine boughs and late-blooming wildflowers. Margaret's attention was entirely focused on Thomas, who stood beside the arch wearing a new black suit that Caroline had brought from Denver. His scarred face was turned fully toward her without any attempt to hide or angle away, and his expression was one of pure joy and anticipation. As Margaret walked down the aisle, she could hear murmurs of approval from the gathered guests, but the words that mattered most came from Rosa, who was dabbing her eyes with her apron. Mira, Manuel, how beautiful they looked together, like they were always meant to find each other. When Margaret reached Thomas's side, he took her hands in his scarred ones and leaned close to whisper, "You're the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. Are you ready to start our real life together?" "I've been ready since the night we decided to be partners," Margaret whispered back, Father Miguel's voice carried clearly across the gathering as he began the ceremony. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the union of Thomas Whitmore and Margaret O'Sullivan, two souls who found each other in the wilderness and chose to build a life together founded on love, respect, and partnership. As the priest spoke about the nature of marriage and commitment, Margaret found herself thinking about the journey that had brought them to this moment. She had come west seeking security and acceptance, but she had found something far more precious: true partnership with a man who valued her intelligence, respected her strength, and loved her completely. Thomas, Father Miguel said, do you take Margaret to be your lawfully wedded wife, to love and cherish her, to be her partner in all things, for as long as you both shall live? Thomas's voice was strong and clear as he replied, I do. Margaret, you came into my life when I had given up hope, and you showed me that love isn't about being perfect, it's about being perfectly suited for each other. I promise to be your partner in every adventure, your comfort in every sorrow, and your companion for all our days. Margaret, Father Miguel continued, do you take Thomas to be your lawfully wedded husband, to love and cherish him, to be his partner in all things, for as long as you both shall live? Margaret's voice rang out clearly across the gathering, I do. Thomas, you taught me that true strength comes from facing life's challenges together. You showed me that love isn't about finding someone without scars, it's about finding someone whose scars tell a story of survival and courage. I promise to stand with you through every season, to build dreams with you, and to love you more with each passing day. As they exchanged rings, the same rings they had worn during their business partnership, now blessed with genuine love, Margaret felt a profound sense of rightness. This wasn't the fairy tale ending she might have imagined as a young girl in Boston, but it was something better, a real partnership built on mutual respect, shared struggle, and chosen love. By the authority vested in me by the territory of Colorado, Father Miguel announced with a broad smile, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Thomas, you may kiss your bride. Thomas cupped Margaret's face gently in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears of joy that had gathered in her eyes. Mrs. Whitmore, he said softly, welcome to the rest of our lives. Their kiss was tender and full of promise, and the cheers that erupted from the gathered guests seemed to echo across the entire valley. Margaret felt herself laughing through happy tears as Thomas lifted her off her feet and spun her round, both of them giddy with the reality of their new life together. The celebration that followed was unlike anything Margaret had ever experienced. Tables groaned under the weight of food contributed by every family in the territory. Musicians played fiddles and guitars as couples danced on the temporary wooden floor that had been constructed for the occasion, and children ran between the adults, their laughter adding to the joyful chaos. As the evening wore on, Margaret found herself in conversation with Dr. Peterson, who had come to celebrate and to check on the cattle that had survived Mitchell's poisoning attempt. Mrs. Whitmore, the veterinarian said with a smile, I have to tell you that your story has become legendary throughout the territory. The bank in Denver is already talking about using your ranch as a model for other struggling operations. It wasn't just my doing, Margaret replied, glancing across the gathering to where Thomas was deep in conversation with potential investors from Denver. Thomas built something remarkable here. I just helped him see it clearly. Perhaps, Dr. Peterson agreed, but it took considerable courage to risk everything on a partnership with a man you barely knew. Not everyone would have stayed to fight when they learned the truth about the letter deception. Margaret considered his words as she watched Thomas' animated discussion about expanding the horse breeding program. I think the truth is that Thomas and I were both ready to fight for something meaningful. We just needed to find each other first. As the party wound down and guests began to depart with promises to visit soon, Margaret and Thomas found themselves standing together on the porch of their home, watching the last lanterns flicker in the darkness. Any regrets? Thomas asked, Wrapping his arms around her from behind, Margaret leaned back against his chest, feeling the solid warmth of her husband, and smiled. Only that we wasted so much time being cautious about what we felt. Well, we have the rest of our lives to make up for lost time, Thomas murmured against her hair dot in the distance. They could hear Rosa and Manuel cleaning up the remnants of the celebration, their cheerful Spanish conversation mixing with the sounds of settling cattle and the whisper of wind through the aspen trees. The ranch that had once felt empty and isolated now hummed with life and possibility. "Thomas," Margaret said softly, "what do you think would have happened if Carolyn hadn't interfered, if we had never met?" Thomas was quiet for a moment, considering the question. "I think I would have lost the ranch to Mitchell and spent the rest of my life hiding from the world." "And you?" "I think I would have found some other way to survive, but I never would have found happiness," Margaret replied honestly. "I certainly never would have discovered that I could be this strong or this happy." "So we owe Caroline quite a debt," Thomas observed. "We owe her everything," Margaret agreed, though I suspect she would say we did all the real work ourselves. As they stood together in the peaceful darkness, Margaret reflected on the extraordinary chain of events that had brought them to this moment. A deceptive correspondence had led to genuine partnership. A business arrangement had evolved into true love. Two wounded people had found healing in each other's strength. "Mrs. Whitmore," Thomas said, using her new name with obvious pleasure, "what do you think our future holds?" Margaret turned in his arms to face him, seeing not the scars that had once defined him in his own mind, but the character and courage that defined him in hers. "I think our future holds everything we're brave enough to build together. And Thomas? Yes? I think we're brave enough for anything." Above them, the Colorado sky stretched endless and star-filled, a canvas of possibility for the dreams they would chase together. The mail-order bride who had thought she knew her groom's secret had discovered something far more profound than any deception. She had found her true partner, her equal, and her home. In the morning, they would begin their real life together, expanding the ranch, building their business, and creating a legacy of love and partnership that would endure for generations. But tonight, they simply held each other close and marveled at the beautiful truth that sometimes the most unexpected journeys lead to the most perfect destinations. The Broken Arrow Ranch was no longer just a successful cattle operation. It was home to a love story that would inspire the territory for years to come. And Margaret O'Sullivan Whitmore, who had once lost everything to scandal and deception, had found something infinitely more valuable, a love built on truth, partnership, and the courage to believe in new beginnings. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.